You've probably heard stories about worm farmers who some of them have experience but they make mistakes that kills their worms, or maybe they're new to worm farming and so they don't know how to feed their worms and it end up in their worms dying. And so for you, you're just getting started in worm farming and so your big concern is, what do I feed them? What do I not feed them? How do I ensure that I am doing what's right so that my worms can thrive? So in today's video, that is what we're going to be discussing. We are going to be looking at what you should feed your worms, what you should not feed your worms, and some things that you have to be careful of when you're feeding your worms. So on this side here are the things that we consider a negative in the worm bin. So for example, dairy products, eggs, meat. These things you don't want to put in your worm bin because they, yes, worms eat them, but they can attract pests such as rodents and insects into your worm bin. And so for that reason, you do not want to feed dairy, meat, or eggs to your worms. Next, we have food that are acidic in nature. So here we have pineapple peel, we have onions, we have orange, and there are many other type of acidic foods that worms are affected by. It's too acidic for worms. Worms tend to like a more neutral pH in their worm bin. So when you feed acidic food, it can be harmful to them. So if you're feeding acidic food, it is recommended that you do it in very small quantities because the worms will eat it even though it's acidic, but large quantity can make your bin acidic and cause you to lose your worms. Now, here we have tomato and we have potato peels. There are some who do not feed their worms tomato or potatoes or sweet peppers. For tomato is a bit acidic but not bad. Tomato and sweet peppers, the reason why a lot of people will not put these in their worm bins is because they have a lot of seeds and the seeds will germinate in your worm bin. Now if you're going to be putting things with a lot of seeds in your worm bin, you want to either take the seeds out or you want to run it through your microwave long enough to ensure that the seeds are dead and they will not germinate in your worm bin. As for potatoes, there are some people who will not put potato peels in their worm bin because potato peels, you can plant these and they will grow. So if you put this in your worm bin, chances are you are going to have a lot of potatoes growing in your worm bin. So the way you can do this is you can dice it up really fine, put it through the blender, or you can freeze it and thaw it, then feed it to the worms. That way you won't have potatoes growing in your worm bin. Over here we have mango, we have coffee grounds. Now if you're using coffee grounds in your worm bin and they just love the coffee grounds, if you are using coffee grounds in your worm bin, keep in mind that it is very high in nitrogen, which means that it will heat up your worm bin. So if you're going to be using coffee grounds, you want to ensure that you pocket feed or you put it in one side of the worm bin. That way all of your worm bin won't get hot. So in case the side that you fed the coffee grounds gets hot, the worms are able to move over to the other side. We have rice in the container here. So anything like rice, flour, cereal, cornmeal, these can make your worm bins hot as well. So you either pocket feed or you put a thin layer in the worm bin. So we have other form of food scraps. So what can you feed your worms? You can feed your worms compost, worm manure. Sorry, not worm manure, but animal manure that has been composted. It must be composted before you feed it to them, because like the coffee ground, it is very rich in nitrogen, which means that it can make your worm bin so hot that the worms will die or they will escape the bin. Next, you can feed your worms cocoa coir. Anything that you use as bedding is food for your worms. Food scraps that you are not going to be using can be fed to your worms. Plant debris can be fed to your worms. So you've just harvested your tomatoes and you have the tomato plant remaining, or you've just harvested your lettuce but you have the root
These and
of the
other plant
lettuce.
debris can be added to your worm bin. You may choose to compost them before or not. Also, you can use dried leaves in your worm bed and wood chips. Grass clippings can also be fed to your worms, but it is important that you pre-compost it first so that it won't get heated in the worm bin and affect your worms. Now, as you feed your worms, the food that you feed your worms are broken down into two categories: greens and browns. Greens refer to nitrogen rich source and browns for carbon based. When you feed your worms, you want to have 1 part nitrogen base to 2 parts carbon base. So things like your manure and your grass, sorry, not your grass clippings, but your dried leaves are carbon based. Now, before we go any further into discussing what you can feed your worms, I just want to take a moment to introduce what next week's video will be about. So, have you ever looked at the forest and you see how luscious it is? You don't see a lot of sign of pests feeding on the leaves of your plant. You don't see anyone fertilizing or watering or doing pest control in the forest, but yet still the plants tend to look even better than our gardens. Have you ever wondered why? Next week, we're going to be discussing this and what's the difference and how we can use the similarities found in the forest in our gardens to get the best result. So if you're interested in seeing that, please make sure that you show up for next week's video. If you're just getting started with worm farming, it is a good practice to get yourself a notebook and keep record of what you are doing with your worms. See what works for you, what doesn't work for you, and then you can get the best outcome out of your wormery. But keeping a record of what you're doing is very beneficial. So if you enjoyed this video and you would like to see more videos like this, please subscribe to my channel, turn on your notification for more updates, and make sure we see you again next week. Thank you so much for watching and have yourself a wonderful day. Yeah man, a time for grow.